Hello students. Today in this video lecture we'll be covering nucleic acids, which is chapter 3 section 5. So this is the last portion of your guided notes that you should be filling out. So just as proteins and lipids and carbohydrates, nucleic acids are a polymer, a large biomolecule, molecule of life. And the monomer, the building block of nucleic acids, sounds very similar, nucleotides, so that can be a little confusing. So nucleotides are the building block or the monomer of nucleic acids. There are two types of nucleic acids that are found in living things, and you've probably heard of at least one of them, DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is found in the nucleus of all our cells, and we're going to talk about cell structure in our next module. And DNA is really the genetic material of living things. It's the instructions that our cells use to know what order amino acids should be placed in when building a protein. So when we talked about proteins, we said proteins are the things that do everything in our body, and actually they're the things that give us individual characteristics. And proteins are made up of amino acids. We talked about how there was 20 amino acids. Well, how does our body know how to make that protein and with what order to put the amino acids? Our body knows that because it's determined by our DNA. Our DNA is the code that tells our cells how to make our proteins. The other type of nucleic acids are RNA. So RNA stands for ribonucleic acid, and RNA is also a nucleotide. It's also made up of it's also a nucleic acid made up of nucleotides. We're going to talk about how the nucleotides that make up RNA are slightly different. So what RNA does in our cells, it basically copies the code in DNA and takes it to where the protein is made. Other things that RNA does is that it regulates gene expression, and we're going to talk about that later in the semester. Now let's look a little bit at the structure of nucleotides. So nucleotides are made up of three small molecules put together to make a nucleotide. So nucleotides always have this phosphate group. All right, in this phosphate group, that's the chemical structure is shown here on the left, and that phosphate group is negatively charged. You see this negative charge here. And then it's made up of here a sugar. All right, and sugars, remember, are type of, this is a little confusing too. We're talking about nucleotides that make up nucleic acids, which are a biomolecule, but in the nucleotide, we actually have other biomolecules. So here, it's a sugar. A sugar is a monosaccharide, which is a type of carbohydrate. So that's a little confusing. Sorry about that. So this is one nucleotide. It's composed of a phosphate, a sugar, and then what we call here these nitrogenous bases that can come in different forms. So these nucleotides, depending on if we're talking about DNA or RNA, right? DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So the sugar in DNA is deoxyribose, whereas the sugar in RNA is ribose. And we're not going to get too much into understanding the differences between these two, but that's where the names DNA and RNA come from, the type of sugar in the nucleotide. So we've talked about the phosphate having that negative charge. We've talked about the sugar, right? Deoxyribose if it's DNA, ribose if it's RNA. And now the final component is the nitrogenous bases. So the nitrogenous bases are basically, they can be one of multiple different ones. So they can be cytosine, thymine, uracil, which is found in RNA, adenine, guanine. And we're not going to talk too much about this now, but it'll come back in our modules when we talk about DNA structure. Here is just a table comparing the structure of DNA versus RNA. A couple things that we've discussed already. One being that the sugar, right, deoxyribose in DNA, ribose in RNA. The bases, the only thing that's different between the bases is that RNA doesn't contain thymine, it contains uracil instead. Again, in this module, we're not going to get into that. We'll leave that for DNA structure. DNA is a double helix, if you've ever heard that, kind of like a double spiral staircase, whereas RNA is single-stranded. So DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded. DNA forms a helix, RNA does not. So here's some visuals of that. So here's RNA structure. So you can see that it's single-stranded and it's made up of these repeating units. So what were these repeating units called? We would call this whole RNA strand what? We would call it a nucleic acid. RNA is a type of nucleic acid. And what does it build of? What is it made up of? It's made up of these repeating building blocks, each consisting of a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogenous base, and we call these nucleotides. So the polymer, the big molecule, right, is nucleic acid. This one is RNA. The building block are nucleotides, each consisting of a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. Hopefully that tied everything in. Here's a picture of DNA. Notice DNA is a double helix, and it's a little bit more difficult to tell here because it's small, but you see that the bases are in the middle, the sugar and the phosphate groups are on the outside. And so this is a double, that's why we refer to it as a double helix. All right, we're going to talk more about that structure later. These bases have the base pairing rule, whereas if you have a cytosine on this base, you'd have a guanine on this side. If you have an adenine on one base, it would pair up with a thymine on the other. All right, the last thing I want to talk about with nucleic acids is that there's actually a third type of nucleic acid that never forms a polymer. I want to also bring to your attention that there is a variation of a nucleotide called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. I talked about a nucleotide being, I'm going to put the highlighter here, nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. Well, this one, right, you have that here, but in the case of ATP, you have 3 phosphates attached to each other. So this is like a variation of a nucleotide. And this is the energy currency, you know, in our cells. This is what our cells use for immediate energy. They break these bonds between the second and third phosphate group, and energy is released. So we'll talk about that when we talk about metabolism. All right, so we've covered all of these biomolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. We've talked about their building block or their monomer, right? And we've talked about their polymer. Hopefully you've been filling out your guided notes throughout this, reading your textbook, and doing a little studying of it, or at least processing in your head before you try to take the test on this module. Thank you.